9 Japanese Zero fighters were closing in. They came from every direction, their formations tightening like a net around the lone American aircraft below. From the Japanese pilot's perspective, the outcome was already decided. The American fighter was alone, flying hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly airfield, and the odds were overwhelming. His ammunition was running low. His fuel situation was already delicate, and the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath him. No American pilot should have survived the next 90 seconds. What the Japanese pilots could not possibly know was that the man inside that P-51 Mustang cockpit had been flying for barely 6 months. He was new, inexperienced, exactly the kind of pilot veterans expected to lose early. But something happened that morning in the February sky. Somewhere in the chaos of climbing aircraft, tracer fire, and screaming engines, the balance of the fight shifted. The hunter became the hunted, and across Japanese radio frequencies, a word began to repeat with growing urgency. American, Mustang. By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered a strange new phase. For years, American strategy had followed a brutal but predictable path. Island by island, step by step, the United States Navy and Marine Corps fought their way across the Pacific toward Japan. Each island captured meant new airfields, new supply routes, another platform for the next advance. The strategy was slow, expensive, and painfully methodical. Many planners believed the war would eventually end with a massive invasion of the Japanese home islands. Millions of soldiers, thousands of ships, a battle unlike anything the world had ever seen. But by the winter of 1945, something had begun to change. The war was shifting into the air. In June 1944, American forces captured the Mariana Islands. To most people, these remote islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, meant very little. To military planners, they meant everything. From those volcanic runways, a new weapon could reach Japan itself. The B-29 Superfortress, the largest and most advanced bomber the world had yet seen. Flying higher and farther than any previous aircraft, B-29s could carry enormous bomb loads across the Pacific and strike directly at Japanese cities. Soon, American bombers were attacking Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. Factories burned. Industrial districts vanished under firestorms. But the missions were far from easy. The B-29 was powerful, but it was not invincible. Japanese anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with explosions. Fighter aircraft intercepted the bombers whenever they could. Even a few determined interceptors could inflict serious damage on a bomber formation. Some aircraft were shot down. Others limped back across the ocean, barely able to stay in the air. Many crews never returned. The problem was escort. In Europe, American bombers were protected by long-range fighters that flew with them over Germany. In the Pacific, the distances were far greater. From the Marianas to Tokyo was more than 1,500 miles round trip. Few fighters had the range to make the journey and still have enough fuel left to fight. Only one American aircraft could reliably do it. The P-51D Mustang. The Mustang had already become famous in the skies over Europe. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built in America by Packard, gave it exceptional speed and altitude performance. Its long wings and efficient fuel system allowed it to travel extraordinary distances. With external drop tanks attached, the Mustang could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still fight its way home. But there was still a problem. Even the Mustang struggled to reach Japan from the Marianas. The distance remained dangerous. The margin for error was thin. American planners needed something closer, and that meant one island. Iwo Jima, a small, sulfur-covered volcanic island barely 8 square miles in size. It lay almost exactly halfway between the Marianas and Japan. Whoever controlled Iwo Jima would control the airspace above the bomber routes. Capturing it would give American fighters a forward base only 650 miles from Tokyo. From there, Mustangs could escort bombers, intercept Japanese aircraft, and rescue downed aircrews. The island became one of the most fiercely contested battlegrounds of the entire Pacific War. When U.S. Marines landed in February 1945, they encountered some of the strongest defenses Japan had built anywhere. Tunnels, bunkers, hidden artillery. The battle lasted more than a month. More than 6,000 American Marines were killed capturing the island. But when it was finally secured, the strategic value was immediate. Within days, fighter aircraft began arriving. The first P-51 Mustangs of the 7th Fighter Command landed on the freshly carved runways, even while fighting continued in parts of the island. The airfield itself was still under construction. Bulldozers pushed volcanic ash into rough landing strips. Seabees worked around the clock repairing damage and extending the runway. The air smelled of sulfur, oil, and burned metal. It was not an ideal base, but it was close to Japan, and that was enough. Many of the pilots arriving there were young, very young. Some had barely completed their training in the United States before being shipped across the Pacific. They were eager, confident, and almost completely inexperienced in real combat. The Japanese pilots they would face were different. They were not the elite aviators of 1941, the veterans who had dominated the skies early in the war. Years of brutal fighting had destroyed most of those men. But Japan still had aircraft, and still had pilots willing to fight. Some were veterans. Others were barely trained replacements. All of them were defending their homeland, and that made them dangerous. For the American pilots newly arriving at Iwo Jima, the learning curve was almost vertical. They had to master navigation over vast stretches of empty ocean. They had to manage fuel with absolute precision. They had to escort bombers for missions lasting 7 hours or more. And when combat appeared, it appeared suddenly, without warning. A mistake in those skies could mean drifting hundreds of miles over open water with an empty fuel tank, or falling into the Pacific without rescue. Into this harsh environment stepped a young pilot from the American Midwest. Before the war, he had been a farm boy, the kind of boy who watched crop-dusting biplanes flying low over summer fields, the kind of boy who learned engines by fixing tractors and farm equipment. He was not wealthy. He had no connections, but he had something else, an intense curiosity about how machines moved through the air. He built model airplanes from scraps of balsa wood. He experimented with wing angles and balance. He studied aviation magazines until the pages wore thin. When the United States entered the war, he saw his chance. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1943. Pilot training during World War II moved fast. The United States needed thousands of aviators. Civilians were turned into fighter pilots in less than a year. Primary training taught basic flight. Basic training introduced military aircraft. Advanced training prepared pilots for combat fighters. He moved through the system steadily. Not the most aggressive pilot, not the flashiest, but instructors noticed something important. He rarely made the same mistake twice. He understood aircraft intuitively, and he anticipated problems before they happened. The aircraft that defined his training was the P-51 Mustang. It was beautiful, fast, powerful, but also unforgiving. The Mustang had narrow landing gear that made takeoffs and landings tricky. Its engine demanded careful management. Its fuel system required constant attention. Pilots who flew carelessly often died. He learned the aircraft the way he had once learned farm machinery. Patiently, methodically, he studied its stall behavior, its torque, its center of gravity. He practiced emergency procedures until his reactions became automatic. By the time he finished training, he had logged around 200 hours in the Mustang. For the military in 1945, that was considered enough. For real combat, it was barely the beginning. He arrived on Iwo Jima in February 1945. The island was still smoking from battle. Artillery rumbled in distant hills. The ground was gray volcanic ash that clung to boots, clothing, and aircraft alike. The smell of sulfur mixed with aviation fuel and the distant odor of war. His squadron belonged to the 21st Fighter Group of the 7th Fighter Command. Their mission was simple: escort B-29 bombers to Japan, protect them from Japanese fighters, then fly the long journey home. It was the longest fighter mission in history, nearly 1,500 miles round trip. Every gallon of fuel mattered. Every decision mattered. He flew his first combat mission a few days later. It was long, cold, and strangely quiet. The bombers dropped their loads through heavy clouds. No Japanese aircraft appeared. The fighters returned to Iwo Jima with full ammunition belts and empty fuel tanks. His second mission was the same. And his third, the Japanese seemed to be waiting, choosing the right moment to strike. The American pilots began to grow impatient. They had trained for combat. They expected action. They did not yet understand something important. The absence of enemy fighters was a gift, because eventually, the enemy always appeared. On his fourth mission, That gift disappeared. And somewhere above the Pacific, 9 Japanese fighters suddenly appeared in the sky. The morning of the mission began the way most long-range escort missions did. Before dawn, before the sun touched the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, pilots gathered in the briefing tent under dim lights while the island was still wrapped in darkness. Outside, generators hummed and distant construction equipment rattled as Seabees continued extending the airstrip. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Coffee cups clinked softly against folding tables. Maps of Japan hung on boards beside photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft only days earlier. The target for the day was a complex of airfields and industrial factories near Tokyo. Intelligence officers warned that Japanese defenses had strengthened. Reconnaissance photos showed aircraft dispersed around nearby airfields. That usually meant one thing: interceptors. Lots of them. The P-51 pilots would escort B-29 bombers from the 73rd Bombardment Wing. The bombers would cruise at roughly 25,000 feet, high above most ground fire. The fighters would weave around them, scanning constantly for interceptors. If Japanese fighters appeared, the Mustangs would break formation and attack. The mission was expected to last 7 hours. 7 hours of fuel management, navigation, and concentration. 7 hours where one mistake could mean dying alone over the Pacific. When the briefing ended, the pilots walked out into the cold, early morning air. The eastern horizon was just beginning to glow. Rows of Mustangs stood waiting beside the runway, their polished aluminum skins reflecting the faint light of dawn. He approached his aircraft with the careful attention of a mechanic inspecting a valuable machine. Drop tanks secure. Ammunition belts loaded cleanly. Control surfaces moving freely. No leaks. No loose panels. He climbed into the cockpit and strapped himself in. Ground crew pulled the propeller through. The Packard-built Merlin engine coughed once, then settled into the smooth, powerful growl that Mustang pilots loved. Everything looked good. Everything felt right. Takeoff from Iwo Jima was never routine. The runway was short and rough, carved from volcanic ash that could swallow landing gear if a pilot made a mistake. Crosswinds rolled unpredictably down the slopes of Mount Suribachi, pushing aircraft sideways during takeoff. Fully loaded P-51s were heavy with fuel and ammunition. Every foot of runway mattered. He pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin roared, and suddenly the Mustang transformed from a clumsy ground machine into something elegant and powerful. The formation gathered above the island. Dozens of Mustangs circling, climbing, assembling into escort groups. Then they turned north, toward Japan. Below them stretched the Pacific Ocean. Endless, featureless, blue water broken only by scattered whitecaps and drifting cloud shadows. The flight north settled into long monotony. Pilots checked their fuel flow, adjusted mixture settings, flexed stiff fingers inside cold gloves. At altitude, the cockpit temperature dropped sharply. Breath fogged the canopy. Hours passed. Japan appeared first as a dark smudge on the horizon. Then mountains. Then coastline. Ahead of them, the silver shapes of B-29 bombers were already approaching their target. Soon black puffs began appearing around the bombers. Anti-aircraft fire. From a distance, the bursts looked almost harmless. Lazy little clouds. But when one exploded close enough to rock a bomber's wing, the illusion disappeared. The Mustangs spread out. Their mission now was simple: find the enemy. Destroy him before he reached the bombers. The first radio call came from a flight ahead. Bandits. 12 o'clock high. Then another. Bogies climbing fast. The radio exploded into clipped transmissions. Warnings. Coordinates. Pilots calling out enemy aircraft at various positions. His flight leader banked sharply toward the action. He followed instantly. Throttle forward. Eyes scanning every direction. Air combat at altitude was chaos. Aircraft moved in every direction at speeds that made recognition difficult. At a distance, friend and enemy could look identical. Only silhouette and behavior gave clues. Then he saw one. His first Japanese Zero. It flashed across the sky ahead of him, banking sharply to evade a pursuing Mustang. The aircraft looked small, almost fragile, but it moved with incredible agility. In that moment, he understood why the Zero had once dominated the Pacific. The sky exploded into combat. Mustangs diving, Zeros climbing, tracer rounds streaking like glowing wires between aircraft. His flight scattered. each pilot reacting to immediate threats. Within seconds, he lost sight of his wingman, then of every other American aircraft. He was alone. This was exactly what instructors had warned about. Isolation in combat meant death. He pulled the Mustang into a climb. Altitude meant energy. Energy meant options. For a moment, the sky seemed empty. Then it wasn't. 9 aircraft. Zeros. Closing fast. From multiple directions. He counted them almost automatically. 9. 9 against 1. The Japanese pilots had spotted him, and they were coming in for the kill. His first instinct was simple. Run. The P-51 Mustang was faster than the Zero in level flight and in a dive. If he could extend away, he might escape. But 9 fighters meant 9 firing angles. Running straight would give them perfect shots, and his fuel reserves were already limited. He had seconds to decide. Everything he had learned in training compressed into a single moment of clarity. The Zero excelled at low-speed turning combat. It could outturn almost anything. But it had weaknesses. It was lightly built. It had almost no armor. And most importantly, it lost energy quickly during high-speed maneuvers. Once a Zero slowed down, it took time to recover speed. He chose to fight, not because he felt brave, but because the geometry made sense. The first attack came from above. A classic bounce. He reacted instantly, breaking into a descending spiral, trading altitude for speed. The Mustang accelerated rapidly. The attacking Zero overshot, flashing past him close enough that he could clearly see the red rising sun insignia on its wings. More Zeros were already closing, trying to coordinate their attacks. But coordination in a dogfight was difficult. Aircraft approached from different angles at different speeds. Too much aggression risked mid-air collision. He never tried to turn with them. That would have been suicide. Instead, he became motion itself. Climbing, diving, rolling, never staying in one place long enough for a clean shot. The Mustang loved speed. Above 300 miles per hour, its controls were crisp and responsive. Below 200, it became vulnerable. He never allowed the fight to slow down. Each time a Zero lined up behind him, he broke away at the last possible moment, forcing the attacker to overshoot. Another Zero tried cutting him off in a turn. He reversed direction instantly, using the Mustang's faster roll rate to snap onto a new heading. Seconds passed, then more seconds. The attacks continued, but none connected. He was not winning. He was surviving. And with every passing minute, something subtle began to change. The Japanese fighters were burning fuel too. Their aggressive maneuvers drained their tanks. The longer the engagement continued, the more urgent their situation became. Then something strange happened. Through his radio headset came a faint voice. Not English. Japanese. A transmission bleeding through the radio frequencies. He could not understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent. Frustrated. Years later, captured Japanese radio transcripts would reveal similar messages during encounters with Mustangs. Warnings. Complaints. Orders to break off attacks against American fighters that refused to slow down. Whether the transmission he heard that day contained those exact words could never be confirmed. But something had changed. One Zero peeled away. Then another. The formation that had surrounded him began to thin. The hunters were becoming uncertain. The final Zero made one last attack pass. Then it too broke away toward the Japanese coastline. Suddenly the sky was empty. The fight was over. He sat alone in the cockpit, breathing hard, heart pounding louder than the Merlin engine. His hands trembled on the controls. He checked his instruments. Fuel was lower than expected, but not critical. His ammunition counters showed he had fired fewer than 50 rounds. His aircraft appeared undamaged. No warning lights. No vibration. The Mustang had performed exactly as designed. He turned south, toward Iwo Jima, course 170 degrees, descending to an economical cruising altitude, leaning the mixture, watching the sky, watching the ocean. The flight home lasted almost 3 hours. For much of it, he was alone. Gradually, scattered Mustangs began rejoining one another as the formation regrouped. No one spoke about the fight. The radio remained quiet, reserved only for navigation calls and fuel reports. He landed on Iwo Jima just as the sun began to set. The volcanic runway glowed orange under the fading light. The touchdown was smooth, the rollout uneventful. But the story of what had happened in the sky that day was only beginning to spread. He taxied back to his revetment slowly. The Merlin engine settled into a lower rumble, then finally fell silent when he shut it down. For a few seconds he remained in the cockpit without moving. After 7 hours in the air and several minutes that had felt like a lifetime, the sudden quiet seemed unnatural. The ground crew approached from the edge of the revetment, tools already in hand, ready to inspect the aircraft for flak damage, loose panels, and the general punishment of a long mission over Japan. He climbed out carefully. His legs were stiff from hours in the narrow cockpit. His shoulders ached from tension he had not even noticed while flying. The crew chief looked up at him and asked the most ordinary question imaginable. "Any damage?" He shook his head. "None that I know of." The answer sounded almost absurd. 9 enemy fighters had tried to kill him, and yet the Mustang stood there apparently untouched. The debrief came later that evening, just as it always did. Pilots gathered in a tent lit by low bulbs while intelligence officers took notes and compared accounts. The questions followed familiar patterns. How many enemy aircraft? What types? What headings? What tactics? How much ammunition had been fired? He answered carefully, not dramatically, not emotionally. He described the number of aircraft as accurately as he could, their approach angles, the fact that he had stayed fast, stayed vertical, and refused to let the fight slow down. He made no outrageous claims. He did not invent kills he could not prove. He said only what he knew, that approximately 9 Japanese fighters had engaged him, and that he had escaped them. The intelligence officers wrote it down without obvious surprise. Encounters like that were rare, but not impossible. By 1945, a Mustang flown properly could survive against superior numbers, provided the pilot did not make the mistake the Japanese wanted him to make. Slow down, turn, fight on their terms. He had not done that, and because he had not, he was alive. Among the pilots who heard the story, the reaction was different. There was something close to disbelief in the ready tent that night. 9 zeros. 1 pilot. A man with fewer than 10 combat missions. The numbers felt wrong. The arithmetic did not seem to make sense. An older captain found him later, after the formal debrief had ended. This man had been in combat much longer. He had flown in other theaters, seen other skies, and watched too many young pilots disappear because they made one bad decision at the wrong moment. He understood exactly what had happened that day. Most men, the captain told him, would have done one of 2 things. They would have panicked and tried to turn with the Japanese, or they would have run straight and level, making themselves easy targets. Either choice would probably have killed them. What he had done instead was something far more difficult. He had recognized, almost instantly, what mattered most. The Mustang's only real advantage in that fight had been energy, speed, altitude, momentum. Every maneuver he made had protected that advantage and forced the Zeros to waste theirs. It had not looked dramatic from the ground, but to a pilot who understood combat, it had been almost perfect. The captain then asked the question that mattered most. "How did you know what to do?" He thought about it for a long moment. Then he answered honestly. "I didn't know," he said. "Not exactly." He explained that he had simply done what seemed logical. The Japanese fighters could turn tighter. The Mustang could go faster. So he kept going faster. Again, and again, and again. It was a simple answer, but it revealed something deeper than he realized at the time. He had trained so thoroughly that the lesson had moved beneath conscious thought. He had not paused to reason through every maneuver. There had been no time. His hands and feet had already done the work before his mind could give them words. The captain listened, then nodded slowly. And before leaving, he told him something he would remember for the rest of his life. Combat, the captain said, stripped men down to whatever was real. Some discovered courage. Some discovered fear. A few discovered something rarer. A kind of competence so deep it became grace. What happened over Japan that day was not a singular miracle. It was part of a larger pattern. As the months passed, more and more American pilots learned the same lessons through combat. The P-51 Mustang was not a magic weapon. It could be killed. Its pilots could die. But when used correctly, it changed the arithmetic of the fight. The basic rule remained the same. Never let the battle become slow. Never let the enemy turn you into his kind of target. Keep speed. Use altitude. Attack vertically. Leave before the fight becomes the one your enemy wants. These were old lessons in aviation. Pilots had understood energy fighting since the First World War. But war has a way of erasing memory. Each new generation has to learn the same truths again under fire. Men like this young pilot became part of that process. Their stories moved from briefing room to briefing room, from veteran to replacement, from one mission to the next. Not as legend, as instruction. After the war, statistical analysis confirmed what the pilots already knew. Mustangs operating over Japan had some of the best survival rates of any fighter units in the war. Losses still happened. Flak, mechanical failure, fuel exhaustion, a lucky burst from a Japanese gun. But overall, the numbers were clear. Pilots who kept their speed and refused turning fights lived more often. And in war, that was all the proof anyone needed. The broader consequences were larger still. As escort fighters grew more effective, Japanese interception of B-29 bombing raids became increasingly difficult. By the spring of 1945, American fighters and bombers were dominating the skies over Japan. Cities burned. Factory production collapsed. Airfields were cratered and abandoned. The home island defenses weakened. The air war had become one-sided, and every mission flown successfully helped make the next one easier. The strategic meaning of that shift would shape the end of the war. But to the pilots, the meaning was simpler. They were coming home. He flew many more missions before the war ended. He saw Japanese fighters again, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in larger groups, but never again in the overwhelming numbers he had faced on that fourth mission. His method never changed. Speed first. Altitude as insurance. Never fight the zero where it was strongest. He was never shot down. Like many men of his generation, he returned home quietly in late 1945. He did not advertise what he had done. He did not build his life around stories of the war. He went back to the Midwest. Married. Raised children. Worked with machinery, understanding engines and systems with the same patient instinct that had once kept him alive in the cockpit. The war became something he carried privately. Not hidden, just not displayed. Decades passed. New wars came. Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War. Jet aircraft replaced propeller fighters. The P-51 Mustang, once one of the most feared and capable fighters in the world, became a museum aircraft, restored for air shows and history books. The young pilots who had flown them grew old. When interviewers later found him for oral history projects, he spoke carefully. He was exact with facts, conservative in what he claimed. He did not exaggerate. He did not decorate memory with invented heroics. He simply described what had happened. And in that restraint, perhaps, lay the clearest proof of all. He had never seen himself as extraordinary. He had only done what the situation required. And then he had come home. When people later asked him about the encounter with the 9 Zeros, he described it almost exactly the same way he had described it in the debriefing tent in 1945. Calmly, precisely, without embellishment. He would talk about the numbers, about the geometry of the fight, about the decision to keep his speed instead of turning. He never framed the story as heroism. To him, it had simply been the most logical thing to do. But occasionally, if the conversation lasted long enough, he would add something else, something more personal. He would talk about the moment when he realized he was completely alone. No wingman, no friendly aircraft in sight, 9 enemy fighters circling like wolves. And below him, the endless Pacific Ocean. There had been nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And in that moment, something unusual had happened. The fear had vanished. Not because the danger was gone, but because panic would have been useless. He once described the feeling as a kind of cold clarity. The sudden understanding that survival depended entirely on what he did next. There were only 2 possible choices. He could freeze, or he could act. There was no middle ground. And so he acted, not because he believed himself braver than other men, but because action was the only alternative to death. That moment stayed with him for the rest of his life. It taught him something important. When everything else was stripped away, training manuals, commanders, doctrine, what remained was preparation. The thousands of small decisions made during training, the hours of practice, the repetition, all of it had settled somewhere deeper than conscious thought. When the moment came, his body simply knew what to do. His hands moved before his mind could explain why. Speed, altitude, energy. The Mustang had advantages, and he used them, again and again, until the Zeros finally gave up. Years later, he reflected that the experience revealed several truths. First, that preparation mattered more than talent. Second, that machines, when properly understood, could extend human capability in extraordinary ways. And third, that the margin between life and death in combat was almost unimaginably small. Sometimes survival depended on nothing more than a fraction of a second. A few degrees of deflection. A choice made faster than thought. The Japanese pilots who had hunted him that day were gone now too. Some had died in the war. Others had survived and returned to a defeated homeland. Each of them carried their own memories of desperate battles fought in clear blue skies above an ocean that had swallowed thousands of aircraft. He never spoke of them with hatred. They had been soldiers, just as he had been. They had followed orders. They had fought for their country. The war had made them enemies. But time had dissolved that geometry. What remained was something different. A shared understanding among men who had once fought each other in the air. A knowledge of what it meant to climb into a cockpit knowing that you might never land again. When he died decades later, it was peacefully. He was surrounded by family. Outside the window, the sky was clear and blue. It was the same kind of sky he had watched as a boy while crop-dusting biplanes passed low over Midwestern fields. The same kind of sky that had carried him across the Pacific. The same sky that had nearly killed him above Tokyo. Perhaps in those final moments he remembered that day. The cold cockpit. The steady roar of the Merlin engine. The 9 zeros closing in. The moment when everything had slowed and the answer had become clear. Over time, stories about the encounter began to grow. Some accounts claimed that Japanese pilots had transmitted a warning over their radios. A phrase that later translators rendered as, "Abort. He is too fast." Whether those exact words were ever spoken cannot be proven. War has a way of blurring memory. Records vanish. Voices fade. But the meaning behind the legend remains true. A young pilot with barely 6 months of experience faced impossible odds. And survived. Not through luck alone. Not through overwhelming firepower. But through the disciplined application of what he had learned. That became his real legacy. Not the number of aircraft destroyed. Not the missions flown. Not the medals that might have been awarded. His legacy was something quieter. A demonstration that preparation matters. That discipline matters. That in the worst moment imaginable, the difference between survival and death can come down to a single decision. The Pacific War produced thousands of stories of courage. Many were forgotten. There were simply too many. But some endure. They endure because they reveal something fundamental about human beings. Our ability to find clarity in chaos. Our ability to act when fear demands paralysis. Our ability to refuse the verdict of probability. His story was one of those. People later said the Japanese could not kill him because he was too fast. But that was not entirely true. Speed alone does not save a pilot. What saved him was something simpler. He refused to die. And in that refusal, made in the space of a single heartbeat, he proved what human beings are capable of when everything is on the line. Speed is life. He knew it. He lived it. And because he did, he came home. Airplane.